We are going to begin right now with Lisa Graves, the former chief counsel for nominations for the Democrats on the Senate Judiciary Committee. She was also a deputy attorney general in the Department of Justice. Jill Wine-Banks, former assistant Watergate special prosecutor and MSNBC legal contributor. And John Heilemann, national affairs analyst for NBC News and MSNBC's co-host and executive producer of Showtime's The Circus, where John Heilemann was able to get Susan Collins on the record this weekend about her vote. And we will come to that in a moment, John. I want to start with Lisa. And Lisa, what we learned from Michael Avenatti in this last hour, which is that by Wednesday, if not possibly sooner, he will be presenting what he calls both a witness and a victim of Brett Kavanaugh. It sounds like he means during Brett Kavanaugh's high school years, because he says what she will describe took place over a number of years. Rachel read in detail an email that Michael Avenatti said to the staff members who the Republican staff members on the Senate Judiciary Committee about what the information he has, because they inquired of him what information he has. I'm going to do a short reading of it, Lisa, and I want to get all of your reactions to how you would expect the committee to deal with this. Michael Avenatti suggested to the committee that they ask Brett Kavanaugh, even in private, as preparation for this, the following questions. Did you ever target one or more women for sex or rape at a house party? Did you ever assist Mark Judge or others in doing so? Did you ever attend any house party during which a woman was raped or used for sex by multiple men? Did you ever witness a line of men outside a bedroom at any house party where you understood a woman was in the bedroom being raped or taken advantage of? Did you ever participate in any sexual conduct with a woman at a house party whom you understood to be intoxicated or under the influence of drugs? Did you ever communicate with Mark Judge or anyone else about your participation in, quote, a train, end quote, involving an intoxicated woman? Did you ever object or attempt to prevent one or more men from participating in the rape or taking advantage of a woman at any house party? And Lisa, those are the questions that Michael Avenatti suggests that the Judiciary Committee staff ask Brett Kavanaugh right now.
Well, those questions are highly detailed, and they certainly indicate that Michael Avenatti feels confident that he has a witness and corroborating witnesses to make that sort of specific line of questioning public. I think that what this shows, again, is the reckless process that Senator Grassley and Senator McConnell have engaged in on this nomination. Reckless for perhaps Brett Kavanaugh himself, but also for the United States Supreme Court. While they're trying to rush this thing forward, they are refusing to call, even to this moment, Mark Judge to testify, to subpoena him. They've refused to have the FBI go back and investigate the matters that have already come forward, and there's a new matter breaking almost every day now about Brett Kavanaugh. And I think that in this circumstance, where the Senate has basically created a kangaroo-type court where Grassley has had his chief counsel interview Kavanaugh, which he touted on Fox News tonight. That interview is utterly in violation of the standing rules of that committee, of Rule 10, that requires a bipartisan deposition, if there were one, by staff, and for that to be under oath. There's no indication that Grassley staff has any authority to supposedly put Brett Kavanaugh under oath, and that should be given any weight at all. There's no transcript. There's nothing there that gives it any credence. And I would just say it's important to remember here, when you're looking at credibility of witnesses, you have one witness this Thursday, Brett Kavanaugh, who now has a documented record of misleading the committee, and he has every incentive to lie. And you have a witness who has come forward at great cost, risking death threats to tell the truth, in Dr. Ford. And so I think when you're weighing motive, that's important. And we know from recent history and most of history that the most predictable reaction to an allegation of rape or attempted rape is for the man to deny it, and for those denials to be false. And so I think it's important for the real process to happen, which is for this to go back to the FBI and not proceed in this hearing that excludes key witnesses, whether they're Mr. Avenatti's witnesses or Mr. Judge himself, along with others who've come forward this weekend. And
Jill Wine-Banks, I'll look at your reaction to what you've heard from Michael Avenatti tonight, basically confirming to Rachel that what we will be hearing when these when this accusation is eventually made public, does coincide with the questions he was suggesting that the committee ask Brett Kavanaugh?
I think what we've learned about Michael Avenatti is that he produces what he promises. And I think that if the Senate continues to ignore all of the witnesses, that people will vote based on that, and that the Republicans will be ousted in much bigger numbers than is even being predicted now. It is outrageous that these witnesses are not being given a chance to testify publicly. The list of questions that Michael Avenatti presented is a great start, but there are a lot of other questions. One is, why hasn't the FBI gotten into this and started to investigate and interview all of his classmates in high school, in college, in law school, his clerks, the people he clerked with? Why aren't they talking about the Kozinski chambers, and why Azar, who preceded Kavanaugh as the clerk for Kozinski, why did he leave? And how can Kavanaugh say he didn't know about the sexual misconduct in those chambers? There are so many things. How did he pay off this debt? And was the debt really for gambling? I think we also have to look at, given everything we now know, as to whether he was then or is now an alcoholic, whether he's recovered or not. There was clearly a drinking problem that's been brought out. So there are a whole lot of questions that, as a trial lawyer, I say, you can't ignore those. And as a voter, I will not ignore them.
Let's listen to some of what Michael Avenatti told Rachel in the last hour.
I'm representing one client who I can describe as a witness and victim, as well as additional corroborating witnesses to what she is going to allege publicly within the next 48 hours. As it relates to her particular allegations, we're not going to provide additional information beyond that which is contained within the emails that I exchanged with the Senate Judiciary Committee. But let me say this. This woman, when she does surface, will be found to be 100% credible by the American public. I would not be representing her if I did not believe her. And if anyone has been paying attention over the last 6 to 7 months, they know that I do not traffic in nonsense or rumor. I utilize facts and evidence. And this woman will prove to be credible, and she is believable, and we are hopeful that the committee will launch an FBI investigation forthwith. We have also asked that she be permitted to take a polygraph examination, which she has agreed to do, provided that Brett Kavanaugh does the same. And we have yet to hear back from the committee on a host of issues that I raised over 10 hours ago.
John Heilman, how do you suppose that interview landed in the White House and Chuck Grassley's office tonight? First with a big loud thud, and then sort of with a kind of like shock to the solar plexus of all those folks. Look, I mean, I think that you, as others have said this evening and over the course of the last couple of days, as you know, I've spent a fair amount of time with Michael Avenatti, making some television with him back in the context of the early Stormy Daniels period. He has his critics, he has his fans, but the one thing, as Jill has said a second ago, is that he produces results, and he boasts about the fact that the things that he has predicted to come true have generally come true, and the things that he has asserted to be facts have generally proven out. So if I were them, I'd be very concerned about the situation. I do think it was ridiculous previously that Mark Judge was not being subpoenaed before Michael Avenatti's email to the committee. The fact that Mark Judge is not being subpoenaed now, if he's not subpoenaed now going forward, is not just ridiculous, it's a travesty. This is a person who, strangely, who I had some acquaintance with in 1987, 1988, when I first moved to Washington, D.C., where he was a frequenter at a bar in Georgetown where I tended bar, and he was everything that you can imagine him to be from the book he wrote. He was an obnoxious, slovenly, disrespectful, thuggish drunk, and someone who
under these circumstances, must be subpoenaed to appear before this committee if there's any pretense or even the faintest whiff of a pretense of getting at the truth of what actually happened around Brett Kavanaugh and around the various accusations that now cloud his nomination.
The evidence comes from the most surprising places. John Heilman's days as a bartender now become relevant here in our discussion. John, let me ask you quickly. I know you spent some time with Susan Collins. I saw it on your show, The Circus, Sunday night. What day was it when you managed to interview her? Because this story's been moving so fast. And what I heard her tell you was that she was close to his decision on the vote, but that was clearly before anything that we're talking about tonight.
It was on Friday night. She did an event up at St. Anselm's in New Hampshire where we caught up with her. That interview took place around 7 o'clock or so on Friday night. So all of the Kavanaugh and Professor Ford related stuff that had happened last week was all known to her. What was not known to her was the reporting by The New Yorker and the Michael Avenatti allegations from the weekend. I will say, to me, the most telling thing about it was her flat-out declaration, something she had not done before, I don't believe anywhere, that she was certain that Brett Kavanaugh would not overturn Roe v. Wade. And we all understand that that was one of the important things for Senator Collins, ostensibly in figuring out where she stood in this nomination. She said that Dr. Ford needed to be heard. But she said that she was at that point, now again, that was before these new allegations, but at that point she said she was 95% of the way towards, I believe, towards a yes for Kavanaugh. She firmly implied that. She felt she had reviewed all of his materials. She'd spent a lot of time with him by her standards. And again, she had come to a firm conclusion that he would not overturn Roe v. Wade, which of course is not the conclusion of an awful lot of other people in the world, including some Republicans. So I thought that this was a woman who, just reading the body language and knowing Susan Collins' history, this is a woman who wants to get to yes on Kavanaugh.
And Jill, I want to get a quick one in with you before we go to a break, and I'm going to discuss this also with Lisa a little bit later. But in Dr. Ford's lawyer's letter to Chuck Grassley tonight, one of the points they're talking about is the committee's intention to bring in what they're calling a former, apparently experienced sex crimes prosecutor to ask the questions for the Republicans. And the attorneys for Dr. Ford are objecting to that, saying there is no precedent for this committee to bring in outside counsel for the sole purpose of shielding members of the committee from performing their responsibility to question witnesses. They also mention that the committee was using the Watergate model as a justification, to which Dr. Ford's lawyers say the Watergate hearings lasted for months, resulting in over 319 hours being televised. A completely different situation. We've never seen this kind of practice before in a confirmation hearing.
There is no equivalency to anything in the Watergate hearing to this. And I don't know how they think that they will protect the men who are on this committee, the Republican men, from any kind of consequence by calling in a female to do the questioning. That is insulting to both men and women. Men can ask civil questions and can get the truth, but it's clear from everything we've learned today and over the last week that the one thing the Senate does not want is the truth.
It sounds like an admission that the Republican members of the Senate Judiciary Committee are incapable of doing their jobs. Lisa Graves, please stay with us. We're going to take a break here. Jill Wine-Banks and John Heilman, thank you very much for starting us off tonight. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.